The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. We welcome everyone to this afternoon's hearing on community responses to gun violence in our cities. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'm pleased that the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security is holding this very important hearing on an issue that is too often overlooked in our national conversation about gun violence: the systemic, tragic, and daily experience of gun violence in our communities. Yesterday, the Judiciary Committee conducted an important hearing on the deadly use of assault weapons in this country. Some have asserted in that hearing, and as an NRA talking point against strengthening gun laws, that the continued gun violence in our cities like Chicago that have strong gun laws indicates that these laws are ineffective. That is not correct. We know that lax gun laws in other jurisdictions allows those intent on invading gun laws to obtain guns and traffic them to cities that have enacted strong gun laws. So today we will focus on the epidemic of gun violence in many of our cities, the root causes of this violence and the trauma that results, and the various responses being developed by individuals in these communities and the resources needed to support these efforts. Our cities disproportionately suffer the impact of gun violence, with the impact particularly felt by communities of color. Too many lives are taken, too many people are injured, and too many families of victims suffer. It is imperative that we apply a comprehensive approach to addressing gun violence in this country, which should include an appropriate focus on these communities that experience concentrated levels of shootings. Unfortunately, communities have developed solutions, but financial assistance to successful strategies is often not available or slow and inefficient when it is. This lack of financial and other assistance is especially evident in African American and Latino communities. Communities often have effective ways to address community-based gun violence. They need the resources. In order to have an effective, comprehensive approach, we must change the way we discuss and address these issues and change the attitudes and behaviors of perpetrators, educators, researchers, advocates, and including us, lawmakers. So today we start this conversation. Too often, communities with habitual occurrences of gun violence receive attention for the acts of the violence, but little to no attention as to why a high concentration of violence permeates these communities. Instead, we too often do not take the time to look behind the violence and find and support appropriate responses. And we do not take the time to listen to the people in those communities who are working where they live and work to develop solutions that are rooted in their everyday experiences. Consequently, these communities are often not factored into the larger conversation around responses to gun violence. We need to examine what are the root causes of violence. What are examples of successful community-based responses to gun violence? Understanding the root causes really doesn't take rocket science, and I want to take a few minutes to describe this. If you look at communities where you have concentrated violence, you also have a number of other factors. You have communities that suffer from the cycle of incarceration and people being released from incarceration who are then locked out of a legal economy, and then people will survive by any means necessary. If you don't allow people to work because they're formerly incarcerated, our communities do not have job opportunities, then don't be surprised when those same communities are impacted by drug trafficking. Don't be surprised when those communities have a high concentration of gang violence. A lot of this information is knowable, but attention is not given to it. So those communities are viewed as communities that have a lot of problems and they are incapable of solving them, or these communities only care about gun violence when it involves a police officer and an individual, and that these communities don't care about violence that happens inside the community. Having lived and worked in these communities most of my life, I know that this is not true. And one thing that was always extremely frustrating to us was we would work day in and day out to prevent violence, have levels of success, but it never received any attention. What received attention was when the violence took place. So I want to give you one example of a community in Los Angeles where we set out to prevent homicides from taking place in one summer. It was an area where there were 300 apartment buildings. It wasn't public housing, but it kind of functioned that way, called Baldwin Village in my congressional district. And we invested concentrated resources in this housing development. We hired young people during the summer, and so when we think of cutting funding to programs like summer jobs, we don't connect it to violence prevention, and we should. We hired people who were former gang members, and we essentially assigned them the task of mediating conflicts. They were on the ground, they worked with the people in the neighborhoods. When there was a conflict that was developing, because they were OGs or original gangsters, they were out of the gang life, but they still had credibility. Instead of sending in police forces, we sent in people from the community, and they were able to mitigate that violence. And we went in an area that was known for homicides. We went an entire summer without homicides. The other thing about shootings when they take place is they tend to be concentrated on certain days of the week and certain hours. And so during those hours and during those days was when we had the concentrated resources and made sure that young people had activities. One of the things that distinguishes areas where there's concentrated violence, where they are areas that are low income, is that they don't have the resources to involve youth in positive activities or employment opportunities for young people. And so I look forward to today, where we can hear about examples of root causes, but also solutions.